of the European Parliament, the European Commission, distinguished guests, dear ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Traffic and the Secretariat of the European Parliament Intergroup on Climate Change, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's online event on the future of fighting against international wildlife trafficking, where we will be specifically looking into the external dimension of the EU Action Plan against wildlife trafficking, which is now being revised by the European Commission. Wildlife trafficking is inherently cross-border, and this webinar really aims at understanding the role the EU Action Plan has been playing and should play in the future in supporting and cooperating with the source, transit, and consumer countries of the illegal wildlife products outside of the EU. Actions agreed under this action plan could have a really important impact on wildlife, but also on many communities across the globe. So it is important to understand how wildlife crime is at the nexus of poverty, financial crime, and corruption issues, and the challenges faced by indigenous communities and local communities. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank very much our hosting MEP, Mrs. Rodriguez Ramos, who is the chair of the European Parliament Delegation for Relations with the Pan-African Parliament, for taking the lead on this topic, and who will tell us more about the importance of this discussion today and the pivotal context we are in. But just before we start, I would like to provide you with some housekeeping information as usual. So please note that the event is recorded. Therefore, the recording will be available on the relevant website page of the European Parliament Intergroup. So I'm sure you will find the link in the chat. And the presentations will also be made available via the same link from tomorrow. And last but not least, as we want to have, of course, a discussion as interactive as possible, I would like to invite you all to send us your questions during the event. And for that, you can use the Q&A box of the platform at the right-hand side of your screen. And in doing so, please remember to choose the option all panelists. And within your question, please make sure to also note the speaker to whom your question is best addressed so that we can facilitate a fruitful discussion to follow. So once again, thank you all for joining us today. And now, with no further delay, I would like to provide the floor to MEP Mrs. Rodriguez Ramos for her official welcome remarks, setting the scene for the discussion to follow. You have the floor.
It is a pleasure to host and welcome you to this early event on the future of fighting against international wildlife trafficking, the external dimension. A special thank you to the EP Intergroup and Traffic for its organization. As a renewed shadow rapporteur on the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora and the Biodiversity Strategy, I am extremely concerned about the unsustainable and illegal trade of wildlife. These two elements are right at the nexus of today's most pressing conservation and development concerns. While it seriously jeopardizes the status of species and ecosystems, it also affects the well-being of people who depend on wild resources for their living. As you may recall from the 2030 EU Biodiversity Strategy, the European Commission is currently evaluating and preparing a revised EU Action Plan against wildlife trafficking. This constitutes a pivotal opportunity to ensure the EU plays an even greater role in the fight against wildlife trafficking, both regionally and globally. Today, we will discuss the external dimension of this upcoming action plan. As you know, elephant, ivory, rhinoceros, horn, and pangolin scales are among the most trafficked wildlife products in the world, originating mainly from African countries, one of the most biodiversity regions in the world. Due to the transboundary nature of illegal wildlife trade in the region, it is key to strengthen the global partnership of source, transit, and consumer countries. On the other hand, it is fundamental that the new action plan continues the discussion with the African Union to implement the EU WAP and works to understand the needs of source countries to address this problem, including supporting the implementation of the Pan-African illegal wildlife strategy. It is important to bear in mind that the EU cannot effectively and fairly support African countries if the external dimension of EU WAP is not implemented in close cooperation with the governments and local populations of these countries. For this, I believe that the next EU WAP should therefore plan clear mechanisms to strengthen dialogue and coordination with African countries, including dialogue with local communities, civil society, and private sector, to regularly monitor the implementation of the international dimension of the action plan. Additionally, we cannot implement these ambitions without proper resources. The EU should ensure that the next EU WAP is provided with adequate funding for its implementation as part of the new Global Europe funding instrument, as the European Commission committed supporting Africa implementing the commitments
Mrs. Rodriguez
of the
Ramos,
excuse me?
sorry, we lost you for the past minute or so, but you're back now. So maybe if you'd like to go back a little bit in your speech for just the past 30 seconds or so. But now we can see you and hear you, so you're back.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Now it's better, no? Okay.
Yes, I think that's better.
Additionally, we cannot implement this ambition without proper resources. The EU should ensure that the next EU WAP is provided with adequate funding for its implementation as part of the new Global European Funding Instrument. As the European Commission committed to spend around 30% of these development and cooperation funds to climate and around 10% to biodiversity. And in my opinion, supporting African countries in implementing the commitments of the EU WAP should be a priority. I would like to call on the Commission for a coherent policy approach when presenting this strategy. At this moment, this year, we are negotiating key environmental legislation, such as the deforestation and due diligence regulations. To be effective, the new EU WAP has to be aligned and reinforce the objectives of relevant EU legislation. It should also support the EU's ambition in international negotiations, especially on CITES and the upcoming COP15, where we hope to have a strong global biodiversity framework. Lastly, tackling illegal wildlife trade also means proposing solutions to foster the legal and sustainable exploitation and natural resources. Therefore, I hope that the EU WAP promotes such approach on top of addressing illegal activities. Dear all, cooperation is our greatest weapon against the poachers and traffickers who rely on evading individual national initiatives. By taking a truly international approach, we can get one step ahead of them. I look forward to the presentation of the upcoming action plan, and I am determined to strengthen its implementation in Africa as chair of the delegation. I am confident that today's discussion with the excellent speakers will build a strong basis and contribution to the upcoming action plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Rodriguez Ramos, for so clearly setting the scene and for reminding us that it's only by taking a truly international approach that we can indeed get one step ahead. And that's exactly indeed the challenge we are addressing today. And thank you for stressing how important today's discussion is, and that wildlife trafficking is indeed a complex transboundary issue, right at the nexus of conservation and development challenges. And also, as you clearly pointed out, the next EU action plan will need to play a central role in enabling strengthened and inclusive cooperation on tackling illegal wildlife trade, and also mobilizing funding to key countries, including, you mentioned it, through this new funding instrument for development and cooperation managed by DG INPAS. So we do need a plan that can and will be implemented on a global scale, as you so clearly pointed out. So thank you so much. And now that's a perfect transition for me to give the floor to Agatha Sobi, who is the team leader in the DG Environment of the European Commission, working on CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. Agatha, you have been mandated to revise this action plan against wildlife trafficking, and we have with us a lot of participants who have been following more or less closely the implementation of the previous plan, some based, for instance, in Africa, who are recipients of international commitments made by the EU in that regard. Could you please tell us more about what the Commission is planning for this new plan, and also in particular, how strong will its external or international dimension be? So Agatha, you have the floor. And if I'm not mistaken, you have a presentation as well to share.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just a moment, I'll share it.
We can see it in full screen.
Okay, brilliant. Sorry. Okay, so first of all, well, thank you very much, and really thank you for the initiative of organizing this webinar. It's extremely timely, as it was already said before. We are indeed in the very process of revising the action plan and preparing the new one. We are literally actually really drafting it these weeks. So it is really a very good moment for that. What I thought I would indeed do is just to give you a little bit an introduction on where we are currently in the process, and also maybe give you a bit of an overview of sort of certain ideas or priorities we have heard so far from stakeholders, member states, and others, just to give a little bit the framework more generally for the discussion. So just very briefly, as it was already said, the Wildlife Action Plan is very well sort of integrated into the wider framework, both when it comes to European Green Deal, but also EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030, and the revision of the Wildlife Action Plan was indeed one of the key deliverables. We are late with it for different reasons. We hope to be able to have it ready some time ago. However, we hope that we can still be on time for the CITES Conference of Parties, which will take in November, but I'll come to the calendar in a moment. This is to start with the current situation. So we have the Wildlife Action Plan, which was adopted in 2016. It was supposed to end in 2020. However, we sort of still feel it's very relevant, and there are many actions that are still being implemented. This is just an overview of the priorities of the 2016 action plan and the main objectives. And in total, there were 32 actions across the different objectives. The action plan has been quite a comprehensive tool and really looking at prevention, at enforcement, but also very much so at the global partnerships. Prevention, it was really about the reducing demand, reducing supply, but also engaging with business sector, addressing corruption, and engaging local communities better. So working with local communities when it comes to conservation and management of wildlife. Enforcement, it was better implementation of legislation, but also all sorts of activities focused on capacity building, cooperation, exchange of information, very much also focused on organized crime and wildlife trafficking being part of it. And then global partnership, they're using all developed diplomatic tools, strengthening the support to partner countries, working, of course, in the context of the CITES Convention, but also in other fora and international law enforcement cooperation. In terms of what has been achieved, well, there are many different elements, but I would like just to raise maybe a few points. And one clear result, positive outcome, was raising the profile of wildlife trafficking as a priority issue among policymakers, law enforcement agencies, and other stakeholders in the EU. There was also, what came with that, increased EU funding, especially for capacity building and international action against wildlife trafficking. Also very relevant for the topic today, the mobilization of EU and member states diplomatic networks in many third countries. So really putting the agenda, putting the wildlife crime more generally on the agenda of different meetings, high level and conferences with non-EU countries. There's been also quite clearly a lot of cooperation cross-border. As it was said, this is by definition a cross-border issue. Enhanced cross-border investigations, notably, that was also mentioned, trafficking of ivory, but also of eels, different reptiles and birds. So a lot of activities there, facilitated amongst other through Europol and in the context of impact approach. Also, in the context, the EU has been extremely active in the framework, in the multilateral fora, and most notably the CITES Convention, with also quite a lot of strong EU proposals being made there and being also accepted, notably, for instance, on corruption, which is a very, very important issue in that context. And last but not least, also there was a ban on EU trade in raw and worked ivory implemented with very limited exceptions. So those are just a few highlights. But it also is very clear that some challenges persist, or there are new challenges that appeared, and there have been also some gaps. And this came quite clearly in our work when consulting stakeholders. So one of the issues was indeed the fact that trading routes and also the species that are being trafficked change over time, and we might need to adapt to that, and law enforcement needs to adapt to that as well. Also brought especially forward by COVID-19, the connection between wildlife trade and the spread of zoonotic diseases. important in the context of today's event, the overall impact of wildlife trafficking on local communities, and also how best to involve them in managing and conservation. Another very important sort of growing element, and also again exacerbated in a certain way by COVID, was the increasing online trade. And also the use related to that use of sort of parcel services. So here comes also the cooperation with private sector that became increasingly important to be able to address. And then that's one of the challenges that definitely is a persisting challenge, not a new challenge, is lack of capacity in many of the relevant agencies and authorities, both in the EU but also outside outside of the EU, which was worsened by the pandemic and also related restriction even more. Again, those are just a few sort of elements picked up. There are others, but I would focus on those for the moment. I'm trying to change to the next slide. Yes. So we have organized consultations, both online public consultations, online expert consultations, stakeholders meetings, also discussion with member states and stakeholders more widely, and also gathered the different elements that have been discussed also with partner countries, for instance, in the context of the CITES convention and the relevant meetings. So one thing, and this was already very much stressed by Mrs. Rodriguez Ramos, is the funding. So there's really crucial that we ensure continuous support to the fight against illegal wildlife trade in terms of funding and the resources available. And that goes, of course, also for ensuring there is enough human resources to actually implement the actions. I think one element in the context of prevention in particular that was stressed by many was a stronger focus, that we should put stronger focus on decreasing demand in the EU, but also in other key destination countries or regions. So China, for instance, is one of those that were mentioned. Another element that, of course, come quite clearly is to make sure that whatever we do in the EU is also matched by support to source countries and especially local communities when it comes to management and conservation of wildlife. Another element that was quite sort of repeated is a sort of wider multi-stakeholder approach. So exchange of information, knowledge sharing and coordination with different stakeholders, including civil society, but also involvement of private sector as far as it is possible. Facilitating enforcement. And there was a clear sort of feeling that there should be increased focus on judiciary and prosecutors. So that there is law enforcement, of course, it should continue, but there should be an increased focus on judiciary and prosecutors to make sure that the offenses or crimes are then prosecuted and finally sanctioned. And here we have, of course, training, but also building networks, peer-to-peer exchanges. And here as well, it would be within the EU, but also with partner countries outside of the EU. Another element that came quite clearly, and that's actually very sort of also comes also in our current work, is that what we need is a stronger framework for monitoring and evaluation, including at national level. So to be really able to track the progress of what has been achieved, because such framework has been actually missing from the current action plan, which makes it more difficult to evaluate currently. Of course, at the same time, such a framework has to be a realistic one and be as much as possible also based on the existing different reporting tools that we already have. So, but that's definitely one thing that came up. Linked to the challenge that I mentioned before, the online trade. So I call digitalization here, but it's really about responding to the shift of the wildlife trade to online platform and all challenges that come with it. Like, for instance, being able to track different social, different platforms, big ones, smaller, to actually be able to check whether there are any illegal trade going on there. But then also actually using the opportunities of digitalization. So really trying to use the digital tools that we have or we can develop. One of this is e-permitting, but also online training, having databases, exchange of information, and so on. And then there are many recurrent issues that come as well. One of those is, for instance, positive lists for exotic pets, trade or keeping. Another is additional UNTOC protocols, stricter rules on hunting trophies, law criminalizing all trade in legally sourced wildlife. Those are things that have been raised by stakeholders, including by the Parliament as well in some of the meetings. So those are also things we have to we're taking into account when sort of analyzing and preparing the action plan. This is just very briefly the sort of process. So as I mentioned, we had some consultations, stakeholder workshops, discussions with member states in particular, who of course will be the ones implementing many of the actions. Drafting, where we're currently in, while discussions and still ongoing at the same time, and we do hope to be able to adopt the action plan by the end of October. And finally, so just a very quick recap. So we hope we probably will cover years 2022, 2026. Evolution and not revolution. That means what came also very clearly in the stakeholders consultation is that the action plan was considered a good tool and a comprehensive tool, and that many of the objectives still stand. So we don't want to reinvent completely the plan. We want to build on the current one, update it, and respond to new challenges and trends. Actions to be implemented by all relevant actors, basically. Taking into account issues raised in the consultations, including those that I mentioned. And also that was something that was also raised by Mrs. Rodriguez Ramos, is making sure we are in line with all relevant strategies and coherent and complementary, and using the tools also available under other instruments, and be it Environmental Crime Directive that is currently being revised, Digital Services Act, or Directive on Corporate Sustainability, Due Diligence, and others. So I'll stop here. That's I hope it was just as an introduction to the more in-depth discussion on the external part, which I do believe is a very important part of the current action plan, and should be of the future one as well. Thank you.
Indeed, thank you so much, Agatha, for so clearly outlining some of the key achievements of the former plan, and also what the Commission is planning around this new action plan. I just wanted to quickly reflect on a question that was in the chat. We are not yet in the Q&A, but there was a question I thought we could clarify on whether we are talking about wildlife trafficking or illegal wildlife trafficking, and just wanted to precise that trafficking is the deal or trade in something illegal. So essentially, when we talk about wildlife trafficking, we talk about illegal wildlife trade. So thank you so much, Agatha, for the presentation, and we are really delighted that you can stay with us for the rest of the exchange, so that you have an opportunity to listen and also react to our panel discussions. And this allows me to transition to our panel of speakers, who will directly, of course, build on what has just been presented. So we are very happy to have with us today a rich and diverse panel of speakers, with Mrs. Tamara Léger, who is the Global Coordinator on Human Rights and Wildlife Crime at WWF International. We have also Mr. Taye Teferi, who is the Policy and Partnership Coordinator for Africa at Traffic International, and Mr. Philippe Maillot, who is the team leader on biodiversity and ecosystem services in the unit focusing on environmental and sustainable natural resources in DG INTPA, which is the Directorate General on International Partnership at the European Commission. So thank you all so much for joining us. Just to clarify first for the participants who may also have seen on the agenda that Mr. George Muncharu who is the head of cooperation and programming division at the Ministry of Forestry and Wildlife in Cameroon, was also interested in joining our discussion to provide us with his insight from Central Africa about what the EU action plan could do to better support the fight against illegal wildlife trade in this region. But unfortunately, he could not join us in the end. But we would really like to stress how important it is to have this discussion with countries outside of the EU in key regions such as the Congo Basin. And of course, we hope to keep the discussion going after this webinar. So I would now like to turn the floor over to Mr. Taye Teferi, who is based in Nairobi and has very extensive knowledge working for many, many years on the issues surrounding the illegal wildlife trade or wildlife trafficking in Africa. And he's very well aware of the policy, technical and financial gaps to tackling this issue and the role the EU action plan could play in addressing those. So, Taye, could you please first explain the importance of having a strong external dimension for this new EU action plan against wildlife trafficking, and in particular, why is close cooperation and intelligence sharing between the EU and Africa key for successful implementation of this action plan? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Justine. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very delighted to have this opportunity, but I also particularly find it very difficult to come after such incredible presentation from Emiti Rodriguez, Ramos, and then, of course, Ms. Agatha Sobe on what has gone on and how much was achieved under the current strategy. In many ways, I feel like my case has been made in terms of looking for the reasons why the external dimension of the new strategy should be strengthened. But at the risk of repeating some of what has been said, perhaps I'll come at it with a couple of points from the perspective of the ground, from the field, from the implementation side, and mention a couple of elements. I think there is no harm in re-emphasizing the fact that wildlife trafficking is an international syndicated crime process. It is global in its nature. It is coordinated. And so for an EU action plan to have an impact in tackling that process, it would not be sufficient for the action plan to focus on work within the EU and member states. It has to have a stronger global dimension at various levels, regionally and internationally. And I think the case has been made by both speakers previously very succinctly. I'll come back to this maybe a little later. The second point is looking at the current action plan, which I would really say is very comprehensive. It does have actions directed at throughout the trade chain of the illegal wildlife trafficking, from source, transit to consumer countries. I would say for that to happen, while we recognize the EU is both a consumer and a transit country in some degree, a lot of the problem is actually outside the EU, especially with source countries and some of the consumer countries. So this again would justify the strengthening of the external dimensions of the action plan itself. The previous action plan has worked on that. Perhaps I'll come back with a couple of specific points toward the end, but a lot more stronger, regionally integrated and embedded external dimension actions should be also considered in the new action plan. In particular, I would emphasize of the three areas of source, transit, and consumer countries, I would emphasize the strengthening of the source countries for a number of reasons. First, while the work in the transit and consumer countries is important, we're actually attacking that problem after the problem has occurred. The wildlife has been poached, or the wildlife has been moved from its natural state, from its natural habitat, and we're chasing after the problem. Now, if the strength of the focus of the action plan is first on the source countries, then actually the problem could be attacked at the very source. And that then brings the argument of actually finding a way to work with indigenous peoples and local communities. I think Madam Sobich had earlier pointed out in terms of some of the areas that need to be looked at a bit carefully in the new plan, and she mentioned specifically, and I'm glad she mentions that, the dimension of working with local communities and making them the resource custodianship perhaps has not been delivered out there, say, as much as hoped for. And I think the new action plan should really look at this very carefully and say, what can we do beyond actually mentioning local communities in action plans? And we do this in a number of action plans and strategies. And I would say the recognition of local communities at the source countries as the first line of defense for the biodiversity, for the wildlife, is the first important point. The second point is for them to have the incentive to actually be the first line of defense and adopt a behavior regime that moves towards longer-term resource custodianship. They should benefit from the wildlife in a legal, sustained, and safe way, both in terms of their consumption and in terms of their legal trade. I would dare say that there has been some ambiguity around this, and that has been the problem. I'm speaking from somebody who has actually worked in this area on the ground. When it comes to involving local communities, there had been the sense, yeah, we can provide alternative livelihoods. Now, there is quite a lot of information around this to say that perhaps, yes, alternative livelihoods is useful, but it does not directly benefit the wildlife, because in some cases, it's been seen as an additional income. The benefits that local communities derive from the wildlife and the biodiversity in general would be best if it is directly linked to the resource base, so that they see that as actually benefiting them and worthy of their protection, worthy of their being, providing intelligence before poaching happens, before illegal activity happens. I'd mentioned that EU was a consumer country for some wildlife products, illegal wildlife products, but also some of these syndicates find it easier to push something through EU and perhaps then slip it to other markets, suspecting that, you know, when things move from EU to other markets, they don't fall under rigorous inspection. So to have the stronger external dimension would help, especially with respect to intelligence sharing with relevant agencies in Africa, in order for the EU then to fight this both as a destination, but also as a consumer country. Finally, I'll just point out that EU has a number of engagement processes with the Global South, through development support, through trade, for example, with Africa. There is an ongoing post-Cotonou trade negotiation with EU, between EU and the Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific. Some of this trade has a wildlife dimension, and here I'm talking wildlife in the broader sense, not just animals, but forestry products, non-timber forest products. Now, in that trade, it will be very important to make sure that all legal processes are observed, including the EU directives on FLEG. And so to have an external dimension in this action plan and cross-linking with these other processes would amplify the outcome and the ambition of this wildlife action plan. So I would say those are maybe some of them are repeat points from previous colleagues, but those are the ones that I would like to put forward for consideration. If you allow me to speak, if you allow me to speak briefly about intelligence sharing, I can just point out one or two things. But most of the points have been raised.
Yes, Taye, thank you so much. I think maybe just to ask you, if I may, a second follow-up question, and then maybe that can link up to your point on intelligence sharing. But maybe if you have some key highlights and shortcomings of the current action plan to share, and maybe also if you could share with us what you would concretely propose for strengthening the international dimension of this plan to ensure that it's properly implemented. That would be also very interesting, of course, to us also. Just a follow-up question on what you were already explaining.
Okay, I'll try. Thank you very much, moderator. In terms of the current plan, the key highlights, I would say it's a very comprehensive plan. It recognizes and targets the key steps along the trade chain on the illegal trafficking, touching on activities and identifying actions for source countries, for transit countries, and consumer countries. It also looks at the different layerings, the international dimension, the national dimension, and the regional dimension of the illegal wildlife trafficking, and suggests and addresses some actions in relation to that. The third point I would say, in addition to this, is it does lay emphasis, although practically it may not have been expressed as I pointed out earlier, it does lay emphasis on the importance of tackling the problem at its root cause. So it talks about the root cause, and at the same time tackling the enabling conditions that make it happen. For example, like corruption, poor governance, or implementation weakness, lack of capacity, and then the challenges related to that. So on these three sort of areas, it's really, really good. In terms of, I wouldn't say weakness, but things to be perhaps considered for improvement going forward, the focus on local communities and source countries and having a really meaningful set of actions that land with communities, that makes them frontline defense people, benefit from the resource, ensure sustainability, has to be clearly enunciated. It doesn't come out very clearly in the current plan. It's a bit generic. And I think this has also got to be communicated with the various EU delegations in the different countries. And it's really, really important that this touches ground. The second element, I think, is, local communities have a lot of indigenous knowledge, but conservation and especially wildlife trafficking these days is very complicated. It's global. So they need support. They need an enabling environment that helps them bring a bit of science, a bit of technology to blend into their indigenous knowledge. In this, the role of credible conservation NGOs and civil society organizations is very, very important. These are the key actors that are in that space of enabling local communities and supporting them and be the backbone, be the vanguard for their front actions. So the action plan, I think, the current action plan does not fully recognize that, and I think should bring that forward, including the work to be done with the private sector. The other area, perhaps, where it hasn't come out very clearly and should seriously be considered, and I think it's been mentioned by the previous speaker.
Taye, just apologies, just to warn you that you have 1 minute left. Thank you.
Okay. The role of illicit financial flows and how this is linked to the wildlife crime. So concretely, I would say these three areas will be very important to bring into the process. Coordination between the different EU processes has been said as it lands in the different countries, and the international dimension, linking with the CBD process, with the CITES process, with CMS. And I'm glad the MET has mentioned that the African wildlife strategy and regional strategies are relevant. And so this action plan should actually come in a collaborative manner with the regional processes so that it can get better uptake and ownership. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Taye, and sorry about the time. I'm trying to make sure we also have time at the end for the questions, but thank you so much for these very, very important contributions, which are absolutely key. Provided also your long-lasting experience working on policies in Africa to tackle illegal wildlife trade. So thanks a lot. And of course, we will come back to you at the end for the closing remarks. And I would now like to turn the floor over to Mr. Philippe Maillot, who has been and is instrumental in defining the priorities linked to the environment and natural resources to be funded under the new Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, which is also called Global Europe. And in that exercise, it's important to mention that, Philippe, you have gathered a lot of excellent understanding of the challenges in countries often affected by illegal wildlife trade, in particular in Africa. And you will, from September, be even closer to the ground as you will move to the European delegation in Cameroon. So you will also be able to support the implementation of existing commitments to tackle illegal wildlife trade there. So thank you again for joining us. And maybe as a first question, as you've heard the presentation from Agatha from DG Environment, I would like to first ask if in general efforts are undertaken to streamline DG Environment and DG INPA's objectives in supporting the fight against wildlife trafficking globally, and also more specifically to what extent were the overall objectives and results of the previous EU action plan against wildlife trafficking embedded into the EU's development and cooperation policy, and how would you recommend these synergies be strengthened with the next action plan? So over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Justine. So thank you also for inviting us to this panel. Indeed, clearly the fight against wildlife trafficking is for us fully inside the development process, because we made, at the beginning, it was not so easy to convince our top level managers, because they say, okay, but it's just an environmental issue. No, it is not an environmental issue. It is really a development issue. My very first mission in Central African Republic in the north, it was in '93, and I remember that 7 rangers were killed by poachers coming from Sudan. I was a bit shocked as a young cartographer of vegetation, and recently the Minister of Gabon, Lee White, he explained that indeed when you start by trafficking and poaching like that, first you attack the big mammals, then you attack the small rodents, and then at the end of the day, what is the situation in North Central African Republic? You have the war, because there is a lot of challenges between people, and this is a little bit a parabola. Maybe it's with some shortcuts, but clearly the link between stability and trafficking is quite clear. We have just to see in West Africa how the unmanaged or poorly, no, it's not poorly managed, but the invasion of jihadists in the national parks, they become really sanctuaries. And so it means that the conservation and the good management of protected areas could maybe be, let's say, stop or slow down the invasion by jihadists. So there is a link between the two. In that respect, from the very beginning, we developed many years ago community-based also poaching, and also conservation NGO-based, even in the big program like ECOFAC. But more recently, let's say, after the adoption of the action plan on wildlife trafficking, we were much more active in terms of the fight at global scale. We were, let's say, the Commission was always active in the CITES and the MICE program, which was not only the monitoring, but also what we can do against the elephant killing, the illegal elephant killing. It was probably the first activities already in the middle of the 2000s. But now recently we have a strong support at global level to the ICWIC, so the International Consortium on Wildlife for Combating Wildlife Crime, with UNODC, Interpol, the World Bank, World Customs Organization, and the CITES Secretariat. And for us, that's really a key element, because we need to work with the communities, and I will come back later on. But we also need to tackle that issue at global level, because, as said before, we have organized criminal networks. And so if we don't have this collaboration between countries, but even not only at continental level, but between the source and the destination countries, and of course the transit countries, we will lose the fight. And so UNODC, Interpol, World Customs Organization, CITES were extremely useful. And we have this global program, but also some regional programs in Central Africa, in Asia, in East Africa. In total, we have really invested a lot on wildlife trafficking, and I can tell you already that we will maintain the effort on that level with international organizations, because there is a link with the policy also. When we have this link with international organization, we can also use that in the policy dialogue that we have with the partner countries. Policy dialogue is really a key element of our work in that respect. But we also want to work still in the dismantlement of networks with some local partners. We have also a strong support to local NGOs working in the different regions, specifically on that part of law enforcement. Everybody knows the Eagle network, so we are active with them in some countries, but we are also active with WWF, WCS in different parts of the world. So this is for us something extremely important, but I can hear what Tai said, that we need to work with the local communities. It's clear. And the difficulty that we have, it's difficult for a monster like EU to reach directly the local communities. That's why we also use different mechanisms to directly work with not directly, but indirectly work with the European, the communities. And this is for example, in East Africa, there was a big program on the regional program working with the communities. Not only on the livelihood improvement, but also on their involvement in the fight against poaching. Having said that, I also fully agree on the fact that we need to develop economic activities, not only livelihood like that, but wildlife-based tourism. And so when we have and we are producing right now a series of leaflet on tourism done by Anna Spenceley, a big specialist in Africa. And clearly, in this case, there is a direct link between the resource and the management of the resource and the revenue for the communities. So when you and there's also a link with the security that in the two cases. When you go to northern Kenya in NRT, all the police initiatives were initially designed for combating poaching, but now it's even more relevant for reducing the human conflicts between the different groups. And so it's really a success where the conservation contributes to the development just because of stability. A last example, maybe in the current on the work with communities, could be the work that we are also doing on the bushmeat management. So bushmeat can be a big source of poaching also, maybe less spectacular and less known because it's more domestic poaching with for feeding, or not feeding, but for feeding the market, but the consumption, the prestigious market in the big cities in some places of Africa. And so we have a big program on sustainable wildlife management, and we are there really at the cross border between conservation, food security, and health. So you mentioned Agatha, health, the One Health approach in your slides. Clearly, if we don't manage properly the flow, for the bushmeat to the cities with the control of the market and so on, it is indeed the open door for a lot of pandemics. And moreover, if we don't control this kind of flow, it will reduce it will jeopardize the livelihood and the food security of the communities. I think for the moment, I think I was quite exhaustive for the moment, but I'm sure that you have other concerns.
Thank you, Philippe. Yes, you were. And I have actually a follow-up question based on what you were saying. So we have this new Global Europe funding instrument now. And could you tell us what this will change based on what you've been explaining just before? So what will be the role of this new Global Europe funding instrument, and also the associated programs such as Nature Africa, in keeping this support, in supporting what has already been done and what you were presenting, and also in going further with supporting what will be in the new EU action plan against wildlife trafficking, which may have stronger international components. So if you could tell us what will be the role of this new instrument and Nature Africa in all this, it would be really helpful. Thank you.
So maybe I can say a few words on Nature Africa, as I did last week. I didn't know that it was you, the moderator of this session. So, because
everywhere.
we met last week in Libreville, so she convinced me to come. No, I was convinced to come, but so Nature Africa, it's a bit the new approach of the Commission for the protected area management. We realize that if we manage only the protected areas and independently from the periphery, it goes really to the wall. And so we have adopted a landscape approach. And so the idea is to manage big landscapes, the key landscapes for conservation and development. But the size more or less is 3 times or 4 times the size of the protected area that is inside this landscape. And there we have developed a concept in 3 pillars. The first one is the conservation of the high biodiversity value areas, mainly the protected areas, but not only. The second pillar is the livelihood improvement, green economy, so agroecology, renewable energy, tourism, ecotourism, sustainable forestry, also when you are in the forest region. So that's really this pillar for and by the communities, not only by the communities, and the private sector can be also involved there. And the third pillar, and probably the most important also, is the governance pillar. So inside each landscape, we need to develop a governance mechanism that exists in some cases where all the stakeholders, so the local communities, the private sector, the national authorities when they have an authority of this landscape, the regional authorities, sometimes the sub, what they call the regional authority, the subnational, but also the subcontinental entities, the donors, of course, also. And we need really to identify a kind of master plan for this landscape altogether. When it doesn't exist, of course. When it exists, we have also to adjust to it's simpler. And this is the only way to convince that the local communities, this landscape, this protected area belongs to them. And so that's something very important. And if we want to fight locally the illegal wildlife trade, it is the only condition. So it means that all the anti-trafficking activities, not all, I will be more precise, but most of the field activities on anti-poaching and fight against wildlife trafficking will be embedded in this approach, done by some operators and the communities in the big landscape. I think it's important because you have a lot of local concerns when you fight and you protect the elephants and not the crops from the elephants. There's a lot of what do you say? Even the French word doesn't come, but frustration, in the population, and that's really something that we need to avoid. So in terms of funding, because at the end of the day we have many ideas, but we are also a money provider for many people, for many organizations, and we like to do this work with the strong organizations like you. I can tell you that there was a big commitment of the president of the commission to double the funds for the external funds for biodiversity, and we take it very, very seriously. This morning we had a meeting with all the Asian delegations to insist on the dev to make their part of the game. So that's really very serious, and so it means that the means will be there. We need to find exactly the best operators in all the countries. So that's so global Europe will continue this work at ground level, but also I forgot to mention that support to IQIC and to CITES will continue also, at least in Africa, because we have reduction of the global funds. It was a political decision also by the parliament. So just a small message that we need more to be focused on specific regions. But indeed, on Africa, it will be very, very strong. And we would like to convince also in Latin America, because it will be embedded in the follow-up of the El Pacto program. So El Pacto will have an environmental crime component quite strong. In Asia, we still need to develop this component with our colleagues. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Philippe, for your contributions. It's really good to hear about DG INPA's work in practically supporting the international objectives of the EU action plan, and also the key role that you play in kind of bridging what is being prepared by DG Environment and what is being done in other regions of the world, such as Africa. So thank you again for being here. This is really, really insightful. I would now like to give the floor to Mrs. Tamara Léger, who's been looking into a very important aspect of this action plan, and which is not enough discussed. That's the question of gender. Tamara has been working a great deal on these questions and has developed within WWF a practical gender toolkit, which provides guidance on how to better understand the links between gender issues and illegal wildlife trade, and also how to better take these aspects into account when tackling this problem. So Tamara, maybe to start with, could you please tell us why is it important to take gender into account when tackling illegal wildlife trade?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Justine. So hi, everybody, and thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here today. So I worked for WWF International, and as Justine said, I focus particularly on wildlife crime, but also on the links between wildlife crime and human rights, including gender. So when we talk about illegal wildlife trade and gender, one could legitimately ask, but what does gender have anything to do with illegal wildlife trade? And according to our research, the answer is a lot. So last year, my manager, Rob Parry-Jones, who heads WWF's wildlife crime work, hired a fantastic gender expert, Professor Joni Seeger, to help us understand precisely where are the links between gender and illegal wildlife trade. So what do we know so far? What do we not know? And what do we need to take into account going forward? And this collaboration resulted in the publication of a report called Gender and Illegal Wildlife Trade, Overlooked and Underestimated. And we also published a practical toolkit, which gives really concrete advice on how to integrate gender in IWT programming. So they're both available online, and I'd be very happy to share the links with you. So let's look at what do we know about gender in IWT. Why should we care? So we can say with certainty that because it takes place in a gendered world, our world is very gendered, as we know, illegal wildlife trade is necessarily gendered too. What this means is that the actors, the practices, the impacts, the pressures, and the outcomes of illegal wildlife trade, as well as the efforts to eradicate it, they are also gendered. So I'll give a few examples because maybe this is a bit abstract. Women and men, we know, engage differently with the environment and with their natural resources. And men and women most probably play different roles in illegal wildlife trade, either in committing illegal wildlife trade or preventing it. This means that both groups can be key allies in the fight against IWT. They also have different information, for example, regarding the routes or resources. So what this means is that when we look to do research to understand the drivers and motivation of illegal wildlife trade, it's crucial to speak not only to men, but to women too. So this can sound obvious, but unless we state it and we put it out there, it can easily get forgotten. Another examples. Gender norms, particularly notions of masculinity shaming, play an important role. So for example, it can push men to engage in poaching. In some cultures, men have been encouraged to poach as a rite of passage for them to go from boy to man. We also know that masculinity and femininity both play an important role in the consumption of illegally poached wildlife. So wildlife products are often sold either as enhancing masculinity and making you, enhancing virility, or femininity, beauty, fertility. A third example is sexual violence and gender inequality. Our research has highlighted that they are highly linked to illegal wildlife trade, and they're actually facilitators of illegal wildlife trade along the value chain. So there's a traffic study that found that in Madagascar, when illegal logging takes place, the rate of young girls dropping out of school to engage in prostitution increased drastically, and possibly with it the rate of STDs, unwanted pregnancies, etc., showing that there are very strong connections. It's also important to talk about how responses, including our own work, so responses to illegal wildlife trade, are closely linked to gender. If we're blind to gender dynamics, our responses can exacerbate gender inequality or gender-based violence. So let's take the example of law enforcement. Rangers are at the forefront of enforcement efforts to counter wildlife trade, illegal wildlife trade. Rangers are still today predominantly men. And in some regions, enforcement has become more militarized. And this can have really negative consequences, not only for women, but also for men. For women, of course, because they are at increased risk of violence by armed men, including sexual abuse. But for men too, this is not a good situation. The assumption that men are best suited for highly armed ranger work puts them at considerable risk, including risks for their lives. It's also not strategic to have a predominantly masculine law enforcement workforce, because research focusing on the police workforce has shown that women are better at building relationships with community members and at de-escalating violence, ultimately making everyone's work more effective. So these were just a few examples of the importance of integrating gender thinking into counter illegal wildlife trade. But there's many more in the report if you want to look at it. Despite the clear importance of gender thinking, so far, the illegal wildlife trade sector has been predominantly gender blind. But we're pleased to see that this is changing. So not long ago, just last year, there was a new UNGA resolution on tackling illicit trafficking in wildlife, which for the first time devoted a paragraph to gender in illegal wildlife trade. This is, quite a positive sign. And then looking forward to the CITES COP, Panama, the host country, has also proposed that CITES adopt a gender plan of action. So we're quite excited. We think this is a big step in the right direction. And we think that the EU WAP has an opportunity to contribute to this too, by purposely trying to take gender into account across its work. So this can include research, programming, partnerships, monitoring, evaluation. Understanding the role that gender plays enables conservation interventions to have a positive role in promoting gender equality, strengthening human rights and environmental sustainability. And it's important to note in conclusion that this doesn't only help us be more effective, but it's also fully in line with states' commitments, including EU member states and the European Union, to strive for gender equality and the protection of human rights more generally. The fact that we recently had the right to a healthy environment recognized is a testament that these need to be linked, and that environmental protection and human rights, including gender, are mutually reinforcing issues and agendas. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamara. Maybe if I can just ask a quick follow-up question. You were starting to explain how the EU action plan could be improved. So we would be really interested in understanding a bit more concretely, according to you, how is the gender equality issue reflected in the current action plan? And if you have any concrete example of what could be concretely improved in the action plan, maybe in 2 minutes or so, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
I'll try and be quick. Thank you, Justine. Yes, so first of all, I must say that gender is not going to solve everything, right? It's not going to be a magical solution, but it does offer opportunities and new approaches. So yes, I did look at the EU WAP and try to identify a few ways that it could be strengthened when it comes to gender. I guess the first point is to be gender curious, to want to find out, to want to understand better, because there's still a lot of gaps in today's research. So what are the links between our work and gender, in each specific context that we work in? How are gender dynamics an obstacle to preventing wildlife crime, but also how are they an opportunity? So every single activity listed in the EU app could probably, have a gendered lens. So one concrete action, as you asked, Justine, action 4 is on strengthening engagement of rural communities in the management and conservation of wildlife. So here, simply, we could ensure that both women and men meaningfully participate in decision making. It might be implicit, but the problem is often when it is implicit, it can be forgotten, as I was saying in the introduction. There's another example, action 10, improve rate of detection of illegal activities. Women might hold a lot of information that could help us improve detection rates, but they're not always adequately consulted. What do we know about women traffickers versus men traffickers? And maybe I'll give a last example is action 16, to improve knowledge base on checks, investigations, prosecutions, and judicial proceedings against wildlife trafficking by enhancing data collection methodology. This is really crucial. Data comes out a lot actually in the report that we published, because data is kind of, the starting point. Data is rarely disaggregated by gender. We might say, so what? Well, if we understand the different roles of women and men, it might also, change the way that resources are deployed. So I hope that's helpful to you, Justine. I'm happy to talk more, and the toolkit and the report are available online.
Thank you. That's incredibly useful, and of course we'll make sure that the report is made available to everyone who was interested in participated in the event. So thank you so much for these very insightful points, which indeed are extremely important to consider for the next action plan. So I would now like to turn again to Mrs. Agatha Sobich from DG Environment. Agatha, you've heard our panelists talking about how the external dimension of the action plan can be strengthened, the need to work closely with the source, transit, and consumer countries in developing and implementing the new plan to make sure it's adapted to the realities on the ground, including issues on gender equality, and of course the role that DG INSPA has and can play in all of this. So what are your thoughts and takeaway from this discussion? Over to you.
Thanks a lot, and thanks to all the panelists for providing extremely concrete inputs, and I really appreciate it. And also thanks to you, Justine, for sort of directing them for really sort of concrete and hands-on inputs. I mean, it's been already really rich. I think it's maybe starting with Mr. Tayeteferi is, yeah, the sort of all organized crime parts, including financial crime, and sort of related it to making sure that this can be sufficiently or adequately addressed, also then in cooperation with between EU and the partner countries. I think that's something that is definitely an important element and has been not yet necessarily done to the extent it could be. It's also something that is quite complicated, I would say, because of data sensitivity issues and so on. So I think it's a process. I think it's actually also linked to some sort of trust building in a certain way between the different law enforcement, in particular authorities. And I think, for instance, through networking, building partnerships, more joint activities that actually can be built up, and also then pave the way for more sort of intelligence sharing at the end of the day. I think that's very important element. And I think the whole generally sort of focus on tackling the before things happen and really trying to address at the source is a very important element of what we should be doing as inherent part of what we should be doing when addressing a wildlife action plan. For maybe, yeah, I mean, well, we can't do much without DG INTPA, that's quite clear. And without Global Europe, I think this is where when it comes to cooperation with partner countries, this is what we very much rely on, the cooperation with colleagues in DG INTPA, but also in the delegations. So we will continue doing so and making sure that it all somehow works together and is coherent with what we are also doing within the EU, but also what we do at the global level and international fora. So I think that's, and many of the examples that Philippe had made are very good examples of yeah, what we would like to also make sure we can build on in the future. And then the gender, I think that's definitely something that hasn't been, yeah, it's been in a certain way already, you know, mentioned here and there, but I think you're right in a sense that there's a much more sort of comprehensive approach needed, and sort of having this lens, gender lens, with looking at different yeah, elements or stages or parts of illegal wildlife trade, and I think that's something that definitely we could also try to look into a little bit more, and keep it, yeah, sort of more systematic than until now. I think that's definitely an important point, and yeah, we'll also see how things go at the CITES, for instance, at the COP. And also maybe here mention that I think also when it comes to cooperation with non-EU countries, we also have the Gender Action Plan that is also basically bringing this aspects to all across the cooperation. So I think that's quite important also to recognize that there are already quite some important efforts done, but not enough. So there I do agree that more can be done. So thanks a lot for those very interesting inputs.
Well, thank you as well so much for making it for this event and presenting also the state of play of your work on the action plan, and also for openly sharing your thoughts now. We are really glad that you found the discussion useful, and we surely hope to keep this discussion going. Before moving to Q&A, I would like to turn again to our panelists and to give you the opportunity to share with us very briefly in 1 minute each your thoughts after this discussion. And I would like to remind also to our participants to use the Q&A box to ask your question. As you can see, we won't have so much time for questions, but that's because we haven't received many so far. I gather that means that everything is crystal clear, so that's thanks to our brilliant speakers. But please do share your questions still, and we'll have a little moment at the end to answer some of your questions. So maybe just turning to Tamara, do you have any final reflection to share based on the discussion we just had? I can't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. I think I would just like to point again to Mr. Teferi's point, actually, you know, really ensuring that, I guess, people at the heart of the strategy. And, you know, one thing that I had noticed when I went through the former strategy is that if you know, search for men or women or children or youth, or I don't think any word does come up, which is quite interesting. And, you know, it happens to us all when we write strategies. Sometimes it's very, you know, high level. But I guess really ensuring that people are at the heart of it, including, you know, of course, looking at gender dynamics would be the key takeaway for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tamara. This is very pertinent. I would like to turn now to Taye, if you have any final reflection to share with us.
Thank you very much, Justine. I would like to use this 1 or 2 minutes opportunity to highlight one other concrete suggestion that I wasn't able to get through in my time, which is about trying to keep the new action plan a living document in a way that it quickly can respond to the changing external circumstances. Now, the scene in the wildlife trafficking is very dynamic, as you know now, with all these fast changing things. They are moving into the dark web, the cryptocurrency payment systems, and the latest now is they have gone back to the traditional barter They're not even using money. They are actually trading goods between drugs and wildlife products, between commercial products and wildlife products. That somebody would actually get, let's say, a package of pangolin scales to Asia, and those guys will send in goods to be traded in Africa at a particular station, and there is no money that's moving, they're shifting it. All this to say that the action plan itself has to have a provision for a periodic review and tracking these external changes, remain, a bit of a horizon scanning, and with the leaders to actually then adaptively respond to these changing circumstances. So it's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taye. Turning over to Philippe, if you want to share with us some reflections you had from this discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Justine. Once again, it clearly shows that the communities are at the heart of this issue. So that's really a development issue, and we need really to insist even more on the program that we are developing on this aspect of local communities, indigenous people, gender, youth. And I can tell you that we act already. We have, for example, the project I mentioned in the sustainable wildlife management. They have a big component is the CRBA. It's not nice in English, so I prefer the French acronym. Approche basée sur les communautés et leurs droits, ABCD. It's much simpler. And so this is clearly in this wildlife management. It insists on the role of communities, of gender. They've done a lot of gender studies in the bushmeat markets and in this value chain. But also we have the same on fuel wood done by C4, and you can find it on the C4 site that we have funded. That's clearly the communities are at the heart of the approach.
Thank you so much, Philippe, and thank you all for all your really brilliant contributions and for so kindly answering my multiple questions. It is now the turn of the participants who have listened to you very carefully to ask you their questions. So I would now like to turn to the audience and looking at the different questions we've had quite a lot of comments on reflecting indeed on the need to support further capacity building on law enforcement and in general on this issue of wildlife trafficking. There is also a lot of interest in your presentation, Agatha, and the whole review process of this action plan. So just to remind all the participants that we will share the presentation and the recording, so you will be able to go back to all these details further. And of course, we'll keep the discussion going. I have a more specific question to Agatha, which is about how the EU Commission plans to engage at the upcoming multilateral crime forums, such as UNTOC, on follow-up with the CCPCJ resolution on considering an additional CWT-focused UNTOC protocol, and the UNCAC on the corruption and CWT nexus. Does the EU plan on leading on or drafting resolutions for this? So that's quite specific, but it could be an interesting one just to have at least just a sense of how the Commission is engaging in the multilateral forums in relation to the work you're doing on the action plan. So perhaps, Agatha, if you have a short response to that one.
Yes, sure. I might not be able to reply to the whole sort of dimension, but I mean, at least when it comes to the possibility of having additional UNTOC protocol, this is something that we have already in a certain way committed to in the EU strategy on organized crime, that we would sort of support that idea and have acted since then towards that. So again, there it's a question also of understanding and analyzing what would be the really sort of added value, feasibility, and so on. Question is also whether it would be more should be more wider on environmental crime in general, or only wildlife trafficking. So, but that's something that there is already a commitment, and that will be, let's say, normally would be also repeated in the context of the action plan. And of course, that's something more generally, a cooperation on environmental crime and wildlife in particular crime and wildlife trafficking would be then taken also in the different fora, in the relevant fora, trying to ensure coherence across the EU actions in different fora, basically.
Yeah, thank you so much, Agatha. And this reflects also another questions, or rather a comment on the fact that a lot of capacity building training courses have been provided in African and Asian countries to governments, law enforcement agencies, and often the person mentions that there is often little effective enforcement resulting of these training courses. So there is a question on whether this action plan is actually efficient, or if there is a need to turn to other form of international cooperation. But I guess that's really a mix of the two. And you were mentioning also that you are working in the framework of these different international fora. So just to give you the floor if you have anything to comment, but I guess that's quite related to the first question.
Yeah, I think we really have to tackle it from all different sides, and I think you can't stop training and the capacity building and so on, but you have to complement it through other elements, and one of them is of course more of the international cooperation. I think you really have to do all of it to be successful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Agatha. And maybe just one last question to a quick one to Philippe about funding. So I guess that's a question about the Global Europe Instrument. Does this entail public or member state funds, or is there intention also to involve private investors on the different actions?
Well, let's say the private investors. I don't know the question. If the question is targeting also philanthropies, because it's another kind of private investor, and we know recently that some big philanthropies are very active with massive investment. So it is, of course, the activity. If we can work with those philanthropies, it is extremely useful. Also on this anti-poaching activities or fight against wildlife trafficking. On the livelihood, clearly, we need investment, and there the public investment won't be enough. If we want to develop ecotourism that is sustainable, that respects all the standards, international standards, but also agroecology investment, renewable energies for the communities, we need private investment. And indeed, the new instrument, the funding instrument that we have, is in favor of this kind of private investment. In terms of public investment, I'm quite convinced that the conservation and the governance aspect will be mainly funded by public investment or by philanthropies, as I said. The difficulty sometimes with the philanthropy is that they don't have the same terms of reference. If a public investor is also very aware of all the human rights implication, sometimes the private investor is more relaxed with that, let's say. And so it's something that, but the fact that working with them can be extremely useful also for applying the standards that we have to impose, because it's part of our mission as a public entity, to also those private investments.
Yeah, thank you very much, Philippe, for this clear answer. I think that was, unfortunately, our last question. I'm conscious of the time, and we're reaching the end of the event. So I would like to thank you all very much for your active participation and for these relevant questions. And again, we encourage you to keep in touch in the future and to keep the discussion going. So without further ado, let me give the floor again to Taye Teferi for a few closing remarks. So Taye, you have the floor, and you have just a little minute, and we'll just be over time.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Justine, and thank you to all the participants for the rich discussion. I'll not go into the details, but what came out to me is that wildlife trafficking is a big program. It's a big problem, I should say. And the response to it has to also be big, and it will require collaboration at all levels. And as Philip noted, I think the most important cog in this collaborative element on the front lines is how best to meaningfully and actively involve and engage local communities. I think there is a lot of thinking that's required around that in terms of moving the agenda forward. I think the gender dimension has come out very clearly. The other issue that for me an important takeaway is the criminal syndicate is very organized. They don't spend a lot of time developing rigid action plans or strategies, but they adapt very quickly. They respond to opportunities. They avoid difficult situations. And I think the action plan should also be cognizant of that and be malleable, be adaptable to respond to fast changing circumstances. Almost in a way, I think we should start thinking very clearly like the criminals themselves in order to try and stay ahead of them. This is a very difficult area. So in this regard, actionable intelligence sharing should be one of the key things, like a cobweb that brings together various law enforcement agencies and the capacity building element embedded in that can basically bring meaningful impact through this action strategy. I will stop there. I can see you're looking at me very seriously, Madam Moderator. So I would like to thank everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Taye. No, I was looking at you with a lot of interest, and thank you so much for wrapping up today's discussion so very much to the point. I think it's really important that you had the final words, given that you are also the recipient, as being based in Africa, of this action plan. So really a warm thanks to everyone. Special thanks goes to our hosting MEP, Mrs. Rodriguez Ramos, all the speakers and viewers of this webinar for your active engagement in today's discussion. And I would also like, of course, to thank Traffic colleagues and the Secretariat of the European Parliament Intergroup on Climate Change, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development for really kindly organizing this webinar. So I really look forward to continuing the discussion in the near future. And until then, I'm wishing you all the best and a nice summer break, hopefully not too hot, and hope to see you soon. Thank you.